Mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, bonjour à tous. Avant de débuter ce panel, permettez-moi également de me joindre aux voix exprimées plus tôt et même hier pour remercier les organisateurs de leur confiance. Ce n'est que la 55e fois que vous avez entendu cette blague, mais voilà, je la maintiens. Mais également les féliciter, puisqu'organiser une telle rencontre n'est jamais une sinécure, mais toute l'équipe a relevé avec brio ce défi, que cela soit pour préparer en amont toute l'organisation, mais également pour réagir avec célérité en cas d'imprévu. Donc, à vous tous, il n'y a qu'un seul mot, c'est bravo. Après avoir abordé, je ne sais pas si on m'entend toujours bien, oui. Après avoir abordé hier la notion de confiance dans une perspective interdisciplinaire, puis avoir approfondi la notion d'exemplarité, la matinée d'aujourd'hui était consacrée à la confiance, l'action publique et les modes de décision. Ce dernier panel, vous l'avez lu, s'intéresse maintenant aux modalités et enjeux propres à la confiance entre des institutions elles-mêmes, à savoir en particulier entre le Parlement et le gouvernement, tout en abordant également une approche prospective en ce qui concerne certains enjeux politiques spécifiques plus éloignés dans le futur. La responsabilité politique, vous le savez, est parfois un concept mal compris, qui ne fait pas nécessairement référence à une faute ou à une culpabilité d'un acteur politique, mais plutôt à une désapprobation de la part d'une assemblée envers un gouvernement ou l'un de ses membres. En cela, et pour reprendre les termes d'𝐈𝐍𝐓𝐑𝐐𝐔𝐄, la notion fonctionne comme un mécanisme d'imputation par lequel on attribue au gouvernement une bonne ou une mauvaise conduite, de bons ou de mauvais choix, de bonnes ou mauvaises attitudes. La question de la confiance est donc à tous les étages dans cette problématique, puisque le bon fonctionnement des institutions semble en principe, et je dis bien en principe, avec plein d'exceptions, donc en principe, impliquer la confiance de l'un à l'autre. Pour parler de tout ceci, une très belle brochette d'experts, à commencer par Lord PHILIP NORTON, avec un premier exposé intitulé « Governing without confidence, the disconnect between the relationships of trust and parliamentary control of the government ». Ensuite, Julian Claren et Mathias Elberoumi, qui traiteront de la dimension collective et individuelle de la responsabilité politique en droit constitutionnel belge. Enfin, Céline Romainville reviendra sur le thème responsabilité politique et enjeux du long terme. Voici donc le menu que nous allons entamer sans plus tarder. Our first speaker is Lord PHILIP NORTON. Professor, thank you for joining us today. Lord Norton of Louth, is it correct? Louth? Is Professor of Government and Director of the Centre for Legislative Studies at the University of Hull. He has written more than 35 books and, if I'm not wrong, was the first chairman of the House of Lords Constitution Committee. I think we couldn't have a better expert on the topic. His presentation will explore the British parliamentary system. It will analyze not only the more theoretical principles of the regime, but also the political reality. And if I'm not wrong, you will take the opportunity to present the different models of relations between legislative and executive as proposed by Professor Anthony King in the 70s. So we are very pleased to hear what you have to say. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. May I also reiterate my thanks to the organisers, but can I also reiterate the thanks expressed this morning to some people most of you are probably not aware of, and that's the translators who are doing a superb job. So thank you very much indeed. I've certainly benefited. I planned to come in under time because that gave me a chance to make some extempore comments in opening, because I'm very conscious we're now on to Friday afternoon. Some of you, Parish, have thought maybe wilting a bit. So occasionally I like to be a little provocative, although I find on occasion I'm provocative without even proposing to be. You know, a case of getting your retaliation in. So just wanted two discursive comments, which then I want to lead into addressing institutions in search of trust, which will lead into my discussion of confidence, and has already been touched upon in the conference. We can distinguish between trust and the more specific element of confidence. Before we get there, just one very specific point, because I was provoked this morning by Frederick Bourne's comment, because he was talking about Magna Carta, red rag to a bull in my case, because it is not what it is made out to be. It's held up as this great constitutional document. It's had all this great significance. Rubbish. It's important symbolically, but not substantively. The things that are claimed for it, it's not the basis of jury trials, it wasn't the basis of habeas corpus, it wasn't the start of Parliament or anything like that at all. I mean, the Charter of 1215 had a very short shelf life anyway, and Magna Carta, which came later, was somewhat different. So it was only sort of reinvented in the 17th century by Edward Coke, who sort of read the sort of whole of English common law into it. And then it acquired a status that arguably it doesn't really deserve. And the monarch was already constrained by choice. I mean, the coronation oath of the 10th century was more inclusive than Magna Carta, and people nowadays read the language of Magna Carta, read into it contemporary understandings rather than what the words meant at the time. So, all free men. Oh, yes, great. No, it said all free men, not all men. Now, had it done so, that would have been completely different. But free men at the time, this was the elite. So what Magna Carta was about was, if you read it, I mean, most of it is just responding to the grievances of the barons, promising to get rid of all these French emigres who'd come in and taken over and things like that, and how to resolve disputes between the barons themselves and between the barons and the king. It's got nothing to do with jury trials and the rest of the population. It was just a dispute between the elite, but it's been given this great status since. So I just throw that in for information, nothing at all to do what I'm going to talk about, but I just thought it's a peg on which to do it. Now, as a sort of segue into what I'm coming on to, just a quick comment, because I'm informed particularly by experience of the United Kingdom, and Mike Gordon yesterday was talking about the importance of conventions. In the context of the United Kingdom, just how much the whole system rests on trust through the use of conventions. Because these are rules that are not legally binding, but they're complied with because they are right behaviour. So the obligation is moral, it's not legal. But we make them work in order to make the system work. It's what Peter Hennessy described, now Lord Hennessy, as the good chap's theory of government. Now, it's actually more than that, but that terminology conveys what we're getting at with the use of conventions. It's dependent upon the people who make the system work to comply with it, to keep the system running, but there's no legal obligation. So occasionally it's come under pressure, as it did under the Johnson premiership, but politicians comply with it. It's right behaviour. It's also in their self-interest, because then it's to stop them being enforced by some external mechanism. The one thing that British politicians do not want is the courts getting involved in anything they are doing. The thought of that, oh, the courts will get involved. No, no, it must remain non-justiciable. Keep them away. So it's self-interest, but it is a moral obligation that is complied with, and that, I think, is distinctive about the British Constitution, and the point we've not really covered, and probably isn't time to go into great depth. What we rely on, I mean, the United Kingdom's got a constitution, it's just not codified, but what we rest on is constitutionalism, and that is absolutely key. Now, coming on to the theme of what the conference is about, institutions in search of trust, just a quick comment about each dimension of that, deriving from what's been said so far, because I think looking at trust and then looking at the institutions, in terms of trust, there's that element of trust to do what? So what is expected, if we look at, say, Parliament's my area of particular interest, what is expected of a Parliament? So are we going to judge it according to tasks that it is required to fulfil? So do you trust the Parliament to pass a budget? So it's required to do that, it's got to approve taxation. Do you judge it according to tasks that are ascribed to it by authorities? So here, we've been ascribing certain functions to institutions and assessing it on that basis. So should we be doing it then in terms of the functions that are ascribed to it? Or should we define functions as consequences? So we're not looking at what's formally ascribed to it, but what it actually does, which is largely driven by, say, political imperatives. So a parliament can have an expressive function, no formal requirement, but that's more likely to be the basis on which citizens will be judging the institution rather than whether it's passing the budget or not. So you ask them, what do you think of Parliament do? A good job, do you trust it to pass the budget? Now, in some systems, passing the budget is politically significant. That would matter. United Kingdom, you have somebody who trusts Parliament to pass the budget. I'm not really interested, never thought about it. So is that just a silent trust because you know it's going to do it, or you're not even aware it's doing it? But in practice, you've got to judge it by what members are actually doing relative to what you think they should be doing. What is it, how it matters for you and impacts on you. So trust to do what? So who's deciding the basis on which we're doing the evaluation? And similarly, in terms of institutions in search of trust, in whom or what is the trust conferred? Because we're talking about institutions. So we're talking about distinct entities, and usually state organs, so legal entities. But leading on to what I'm going to come on to now, institutions are essentially the sum of their parts. So are we judging the entity, what, say, members of the body are doing collectively, or are we judging them on what they do individually? And that is what I want to lead into with just one or two discursive comments before I even address confidence. Oh, yeah. It seems reluctant to... try? Oh, very good. Which one did you press?
Just this.
That's what I press. But with my luck, I was expecting that. Anyway, I don't know if you can read that. But there is a problem in terms of looking at what the members do and evaluating them. So a tendency for citizens to judge members of Parliament on what they do individually rather than collectively. So we can devise grand schemes of structures within Parliament, very good committees, they're going to question, they're going to challenge government, but that's not necessarily going to affect the trust in the institution by citizens, because they're not that much alert to what the body is doing through these different institutional mechanisms. They're more concerned to judge the members what they do as individuals. And that is a problem, because as I've made the point there, citizens generalise about the legislature from bad behaviour by one or two members. So as the example, that MP is corrupt, they're all corrupt. You only need one or two. Now, we know that from experience. I mean, in 1994, we had the Cash for Questions scandal in Britain, and that led to the Nolan Committee and the Nolan Principles. Two MPs had been found to accept money for tabling parliamentary questions. Shortly afterwards, a survey found, I think, something like 60–65% of the people thought that most MPs made money by using public office improperly. 2 out of over 600. But people generalise about it from misbehaviour by a minority, 1 or 2. Unfortunately, it then doesn't work the other way round. So if an MP is doing a good job as a, say, a constituency member, people then don't generalise about the institution from that behaviour. They see it as very distinct. This is a service provider by the local MP, or very good constituency member, but that doesn't translate into perceptions of the institution of which that member, to which that member belongs, because they see it then in terms of the members collectively in the chamber or not in the chamber and empty green benches, or when they're there shouting at one another, negative perception. So perceptions of the institution, whether the House of Commons is doing a good job or a bad job, is distinct from your evaluation of your local member of parliament. So typically the evaluation of the MP goes, well, it runs independently of evaluations of the institution. So how are you actually going to assess the institution? So that's a problem. How do you instill trust in the institution on the basis of what those who are in the institution, the members, are doing, rather than the tasks you're ascribing to the institution? And then there's another problem, which, if it responds... Oh, there you go. Thank you, it's working. The other problem is, from the point of view of parliaments, in restoring trust, so there's declining trust in parliaments, we know that. What is the institutional mechanism for responding? Because by the nature of the institution, a legislature is the sum of its parts, the members. So we talk about legislatures as institutions, but in terms of how it behaves, you've got to look at it as the aggregation of the members. So who speaks for the legislature? It's criticised, lack of trust. How do you speak for the legislature to defend it, to promote it, when there is no one there to do it? Because if you think about it, it's the sum of its parts. There might be an authority figure within the institution, so houses have speakers. They're not necessarily authorised to speak for the body. Their writ might run within the institution, but not necessarily externally. And obviously, with a bicameral legislature, you've then got a problem. You've got two distinct entities. Certainly in the United Kingdom, you've got the House of Commons, a distinct entity with its own organisation. You've got House of Lords, completely distinct, well, self-regulating, very different to the House of Commons. So there's no one person who has the authority to speak for Parliament. And arguably, there's no one person who can speak for either house in terms of its outward-facing role. Because there'll be disputes between leaders within the institution as to what you can actually say. So even if a house gets its act together, it's far too late after it's lost its trust. There is no means of quickly responding to the negative perceptions that there may be of the institution because of the behaviour of members. So that's a problem there. The link with what I'll come on to is just to think about the institution as the aggregation of the members and the behaviour of members. That's, I think, the key point. So that's my prologue before talking about confidence, and I've also been asked to talk about accountability. There we go. So let's look at the question of confidence. Now, within parliamentary systems, confidence is core. Virtually all parliamentary systems have a mechanism by which the confidence of the body can be tested. So the government rests on the confidence of, well, we'd say the Parliament. That's not strictly true. It rests on the confidence of the principal chamber. So in a unicameral legislature, there's no issue. It's the one chamber. In a bicameral legislature, I think with one exception, it's the principal elected chamber. I think there's one exception where it's a joint meeting. But the executive rests on the confidence of the legislative parliamentary system. That's one of the core features of a parliamentary system. So if the Parliament withholds its confidence, the government falls. Now, confidence itself may take different forms. So it can be made explicit or assumed. Now, normally it's assumed, i.e. a party, or two parties come together to form a coalition, as long as they've got a majority, clearly have a majority, then they are deemed to command the confidence of the Parliament. It doesn't necessarily need to be tested through a vote. Now, in some cases it is, you need the investiture vote at the start, but that's the exception rather than the rule. So it only comes in if the government is challenged, a vote is moved, which may be a vote, an explicit vote of no confidence, or in some systems, the government itself could move a vote of confidence in itself, and if it loses, it's lost the confidence. So in the United Kingdom, if a government loses a vote of confidence, whether it's a vote of no confidence or a confidence motion that's defeated, then by convention, it either resigns or requests dissolution, so elections. And the practice in recent times has been to request an election. So that's the formal position, relatively straightforward, and normally governments command the confidence of the House because they've got a majority. As long as it's a working majority, then they're likely to be in office for the full term. But what about governing without confidence, which is what I've asked to address, which is not something we really have to wrestle with in the United Kingdom, but you can get that situation. And the issue arises, oops, there we go, in two respects. So a government may lack the confidence of the House because of the point I'll come on to is political configurations. So it may lack the confidence, but it's not amenable, it's not voted out by a vote of confidence. So, so it remains either because of the formal rules and or the political configuration, which is what I want to stress, because I want to bring the politics into this discussion. So it's not just the entity, the formal powers, oh, the Parliament can vote out a government. Well, it may not do because of the politics. And here the political configuration becomes important, and as the chairman mentioned, I'll come on to the configuration based on the work of Anthony King. But if we look at the rules, you'll see that there are different forms of rules, but in terms of how they vary, it can be in terms of initiation. So there may be a threshold that has to be met to actually trigger a vote. So initiation's one thing, but then voting, arguably more important. So in some cases, it's not just a simple majority to pass a motion of no confidence. It may require an absolute majority, now, or potentially a supermajority. Now, in a way, I've put up there the United Kingdom from 2011 to 2022, which is it's a bit of a cheat, but it's to demonstrate the provisions occasionally of having supermajorities. Now, in the United Kingdom, that supermajority provision doesn't actually come from vote of confidence as such, but in 2011, product of a deal done between the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats to form a coalition, the government introduced a fixed-term Parliaments bill, which became the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act. So that was to stipulate Parliament would last for a term of 5 years. Each Parliament would last for a term of 5 years. Now, the drafters of the bill sort of forgot about votes of confidence. So some of us had to draw their attention to it. So then the bill had to be redrawn. So stipulated Parliament would last 5 years unless either the House of Commons, by a 2/3 majority of all MPs, voted for an early election, or the House of Commons passed an explicit vote that this House has no confidence in Her Majesty's government. So the statute provision as to the actual wording. So a motion of confidence that was defeated would no longer qualify, wouldn't apply. And that could be passed by a simple majority. But there was a provision for 2/3 of all members would have to vote if the government tried to trigger an early general election. And at the time, some people argue it's a dead letter who would vote against an early election if government brought that forward. 2017, Theresa May as Prime Minister brought forward a motion for an early election. Yeah, let's have an early election. So people thought it's dead letter. 2019, slight dispute over Brexit and the withdrawal agreement. Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, tried 3 times to get a motion passed for an early general election. Each time he failed to get the required 2/3 majority, because what it did was it gave a veto power to the opposition, because all it needed to do was abstain in a vote, and the 2/3 requirement of all MPs would not be met. So 3 times he failed to get an early general election. He then got one by introducing a new Act of Parliament saying there'll be an early election, Fixed-Term Parliaments Act notwithstanding, and of course he only needed a simple majority to get that Act through, so we did eventually end up with an early general election, and in 2022, the Conservative government introduced a repeal measure, the Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Act, that got rid of that and put everything back to what it had been before 2011. But I just use that as an illustrative occasion. There might be extraordinary provision for, in that case, triggering an election. And the other provision in terms of the rules, of course, constructive vote of no confidence. So you're not just voting out a government, you've got to have some government in play, ready in place to take its place. So there can be very restrictive rules, so that limits what happens. And I mentioned there's an article just being published in Political Studies showing that where there are restrictive rules, it tends to produce cooperative strategies between political parties. So that's the position in terms of the rules. But then the other thing, and I think politically much more significant, the configuration that there is between the different parties within the legislature. Again, I come back to the point, we tend to talk about the legislature, about the chamber and what it does. But the point that Anthony King draws out is it's what happens within the chamber. It's a mix of relationships. It's not just government and an opposition. There are a whole range of relationships that take place between the executive and other entities within the House. So you see there I've listed the 5 modes of executive-legislative relationships that he identified. So you've got the opposition mode, which is predominant in Westminster systems. So that's where you've got an adversarial system, government versus opposition, and the purpose of parties, as Anthony King put it, is domination, not accommodation. But then you've got the intra-party mode, because if you're a party with an absolute majority, then what matters is not the opposition, they're a minority, it's what happens within your own party. So the most important relationship is between the executive and the members sat behind it, not the members sat in front of it. So it's not the opposition, you've got to win. It's the members sat behind you. Are they going to support you? You assume they will. You're all like-minded, that's why you're all members of the same party. But there may be issues on which they don't. So carrying your own party can be significant. Then you've got inter-party relationships, so the relationship between different parties. That matters especially in coalition, because there you're talking about holding the parties together within the coalition. So if you are in a coalition, then the Prime Minister has the problem of keeping on board another party or parties, while at the same time looking over their own shoulder. The intra-party mode still holds, to keep your own side on, your own supporters on side, because they may be a bit wary of your coalition partner. So certainly when we had a coalition from 2010, 2015, David Cameron was sort of having to balance keeping the Liberal Democrats on side and his own supporters who weren't always that nice towards the Liberal Democrats. Because on constitutional issues, the two parties adopted diametrically opposed approaches. So very difficult keeping them all on board. So the inter-party mode can be quite significant. Cross-parties where they work across parties, non-parties where issues come up, there's no party engagement, so you just leave it to the members, so that really doesn't involve confidence. So, I say, if the government enjoys a single-party majority, then the intra-party mode is core to relationships. A majority coalition, then the intra-party and inter-party mode are core, as just outlined. And if it's a non-majority coalition or a minority government, then you've got all the opposition, intra-party and inter-party modes become core. But because you've got these different configurations, they may not have confidence in you, but they may not be able to mobilise among the different groupings to mobilise support to remove you. So you may be able to carry on that basis. So it can be a case of sort of manipulating the different configurations in order to keep in play. And then there's the political constraints as well, may lack the the confidence of other parties, but I'm afraid you've then got the electoral reality. It may not be in the other party's interest to trigger a vote of no confidence if it's going to lead to a general election in which they cannot be confident of victory. So it may serve the other party's benefit to keep you in office while they build up support for whenever the election comes, but it may not be to the benefit of those parties for it to take place then. So my point is merely the politics of it all. So you can't talk in terms of executive-legislative relationships. Here's the government, here's the entity that's the legislature of the House, and the relationship between the two. You've got to look at those political configurations, and those configurations are not necessarily static. So you can have a fairly fluid relationship between those different elements during the lifetime of a parliament. So from a government point of view, at times it's manipulation, playing perhaps opponents off against one another to hold the line for as long as you need, until such time as you think an election would actually benefit you. So it's really just to draw attention. I'm not going to go into great detail on the particular examples. It's just, as I say, from my point of view, to put the politics into it and not simply look at it in formal terms. So that's the point about votes of confidence. Now, in a way, you could look at a vote of confidence anyway as a power held in reserve, because it's not something that's going to be regularly utilised. It's if government acts in such a way as there are something happens that would raise the issue of confidence, which would not normally happen. So it's not a pervasive activity. What is pervasive is the accountability of the executive to the legislature. But again, those different configurations come in because you're responding to different bodies. So if we look at it from the point of view of accountability, oops. Oh, there we go. There we go. The challenges there are in terms of the legislature holding the government to account, because if the government has a majority, not only will it carry a vote of confidence, but of course, in essence, the principle of control is reversed, because the legislature isn't controlling the executive, it's the executive has got control because it's got a majority. So party determines government will get its way, but you're in a way reliant on the party system to ensure that the government is challenged, it's questioned, even though it knows it's got the confidence of the House, it can carry on governing. So it is a challenge holding it to account, particularly in a majority system. So in the United Kingdom, the key point when government's discussing whether to bring forward legislation, there's a legislation committee of the Cabinet chaired by the Leader of the House of Commons, and in a way the more important question from a government point of view is not so much do we have the votes, but do we have the time? So the constraint is more institutional in terms of getting things through within the time, and the constraint in terms of relation to political opponents is they've got a platform. So a government might win the vote, won't necessarily win the argument. So that's the more important consideration, not so much this formality of voting, of holding government, holding a vote of confidence, anything like that. It's allowing the other parties the opportunity to publicly question, to challenge, to probe government. So how the legislature is configured is most important in that respect. So I say the government will normally get its way because that principle of control is reversed. And it becomes more difficult, so I was to talk about delegation, and that means different things in different systems. But from sort of British point of view, thinking about powers that are delegated through different forms, particularly second legislation. So you've got a problem because there's that independent or quasi-independent capacity of government to act through long-standing prerogative powers, so typically declaring war, for example, but also now increasingly powers delegated to ministers through secondary legislation. So primary legislation confers powers on ministers. and that is then a challenge in many respects in terms of form, but also substance. So if we look at there we go. The different methods. Sorry, just move on to the next one. So the different methods of accountability. So there are different means available. So there's the plenary. You have different methods, debates, you'd have questions. You've got different committees in the different parliaments, scrutiny committees, maybe evidence taking. Then there are legislative committees dealing with the bills they're going through. They will differ between Westminster systems, where the legislative committees tend to be open and adversarial, and West European consensus systems, where they tend to be closed and consensual, so they're more the sites of deal-making, deal confirmation. The United Kingdom, it's just the usual government versus opposition. Government's going to get its way, so it might as well all be public, because there are no deals being done. But the committees are committees of the House, so exceptionally in a place like Italy, some committees can transpose measures into law, but not normally. So most of these mechanisms are persuasive, not definitive. So it's a way of challenging government, of holding it to account through public scrutiny, from opening it up to questioning and forcing government to justify what it's doing. So as I say, challenging it, trying to win the argument. So in terms of the focus of accountability, that can differ as well. But what is taking place, as I say, it's persuasive, it's not definitive, and what it's challenging is what government is doing in terms of its policy proposals, might be challenging primary legislation. But there's a problem in actually doing that now effectively. So whether this can impact on trust, if people think, well, the legislature is not doing what we expect it to do, or what you expect of the members collectively in challenging government. So the real problem in terms of accountability is, I think, the growth of things like delegated legislation, because there's so much more of it. Legislation is becoming more complex. It's not just more of it. In the United Kingdom, the volume of legislation has expanded massively. There aren't more bills being introduced by government. It's just that they're longer. Each one is longer than they used to be, and much more complex. And this is a challenge for legislature, because government will be bringing in bigger, more complex bills, but there's limited time, specified time, for the Parliament to actually process them. And now this will vary from Parliament to Parliament in terms of the rules that are applied, the length of term from which a bill can remain on the agenda. So you've got highly restrictive, as in the United Kingdom, a bill's got to pass within the parliamentary session, which basically means the year. Otherwise it falls, through to, I think, the Dutch case where they can remain on the agenda forever. So you've got limitations in terms of institutional constraints of time, of being able to deal with a growing body of legislation that's more complex, and there may be... right. Is that 35? Yeah, that's fine. Oh, right. I thought it said 35 minutes. I thought, I'm nearly finished. I can't go on for another 35 minutes. Well, I could, but that's on the... start talking about other things. So, and to some extent, absence of dedicated mechanisms of scrutiny. So there might be dedicated committees for looking at things like bills, but there might be a problem with generating mechanisms for scrutinising delegated legislation, because it's highly complex, very detailed. And then the final point I want to end on in my just under now 3 minutes is a key point that I would hope would be apparent in some things I've been saying, but I want to make it explicit, because it's a thing that's often left out. Because people keep coming up with, oh, Parliament must do this, and you come up with this grand scheme for reform. This is how we reform Parliament. You know, we have these committees, that committees, and these great tracks of reform. Same with constitutional reform. You can take this writ large. And I keep going on, well, yes, grand, very good, where you want to go. How are you going to get there? you're not going to get there unless there's the political will to actually implement these things. And if the government controls the agenda, has got the votes, how are you actually going to mobilise achieving that? Members will be busy, certainly in the United Kingdom, focused on constituency work. They'll be focused on the political activity that is politically sexy, that will get them attention. So lots of what I've just been talking about is the boring stuff that's not politically sexy, won't get them any attention. So that's a challenge. I mean, that's one of the benefits. I'll just quickly digress 30 seconds to say the benefit of the British system, with the bicameral system we've got, because the House of Lords, because it's not elected, can focus on the boring stuff, the detailed legislative scrutiny. It's not politically sexy, it doesn't get any attention, but we don't need the attention. The Commons does, so MPs don't deal with it. So there is a question of political will. How are you going to mobilise the political will to achieve particular outcomes? That is quite often the missing link in any discussion that takes place about change of making an institution work. You've got to have the political will. Where does that come from? How do you trigger it within the system? And then what are the consequences for how citizens perceive the institution? Because they won't be necessarily interested in that either. They're interested in whether the politicians are delivering things that matter to them and of which they're aware, which is that more micro-level service delivery, which is important to them. That's the basis that matters to them. But the worrying thing is the legislature qua legislature doesn't benefit. The benefit goes to the individual member. So I'm ending on a rather depressing point. The problem, how do we mobilise that political will? How do we get people to trust the institution when they're not thinking about what the institution is doing qua institution? So it's all very well as saying, well, this is what the institution should be doing, this is how we should judge it. There's a real world out there of electors who are judging it on a totally different basis. And that, I think, is the real challenge facing legislatures.